If you look at the tribes today, there is just a handful of tribes that engage in international business and international trade. What happened to Native nations? If we look at some of the ruins in Chaco Canyon, Pakime, Cahokia, Etzanoa, all the way in the Pacific Northwest, those are evidence that Native nations knew how to do international business among each other. The word international, inter meaning among, national meaning nations, among nations. Tribes once engaged in business among Native people, Native nations. We knew how to do international trade. We knew international business. We sold products, we sold services. This is an absolute fact. But somewhere along the way, we forgot that. Somewhere along the way, we learned how to put our hands out and say "Shah" to the federal government. They taught us how to do that. They took not only our language, Nehizad, but also Neheol, Nehenanta. They took all of that from us, and they took our way of business. And so, all roads lead to Chaco Canyon. The concept behind it is to revitalize business among Native nations, among Native people. Imagine there are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Imagine if every single one of those tribes did business with each other. If Navajo Nation relied on the Apache Nation, Hopi Nation, all the nations on the East Coast for their products and services, not relying on American corporations, not relying on the states or the federal government. Imagine the trade network that will come from that. The World Trade Organization, which was established in 1992, would not have as many members as a Native Indigenous trade network. And that's just the United States. What about the First Nations in Canada, Indigenous people in Mexico, Indigenous people in South America, all the way down to New Zealand, Australia? Our stories tell of a time when we did business with the Aztecs, the Mayans, the Incas. In Chaco Canyon, they found chocolate that could only be traced to South America. That was the drink of royalty in the Incan and the Mayan nations. How did it end up in Chaco Canyon? What was the purpose? International trade, international business. Our theory, my partner and I, our theory is that if we were to put international trade back into the economy, then the economy will begin to grow. You can only grow so much as an economy without international trade. At some point, you need to do international trade. You need to make treaties. You need to make trade deals. And we did that. We just forgot how. So the conference, All Roads Lead to Chaco Canyon, is to re-educate not only Native people, but non-Native people about international trade among Indigenous peoples, about international common law, international business. It goes beyond what we're doing in Navajo Nation. It goes beyond what we're doing in the United States, in the state of Arizona. This reaches all across the world. That is the idea behind All Roads Lead to Chaco Canyon. Every single economy of Indigenous peoples in the United States should link to the ruins in Chaco Canyon, Cahokia, Etzanoa, Pakime, Casas Grandes. That is our vision for Native nations, Native people, breaking the cycle of what we've been taught, breaking the system that has been put in place through federal Indian law, and that's the starting point of this conference. We start every single conference with a lecture on federal Indian law. That's what we're going to jump into. You see the title of my presentation, Federal Indian Law, this is why we can't have nice things. That's my motto. I say that all the time. Every time something happens in Navajo Nation, I say, this is why we can't have nice things. It's not really the fault of Navajo Nation. It's usually the fault of the feds or the states or the Supreme Court or Congress, the senators. So let's get to federal Indian law. Let me start by introducing myself. My name is Joe Austin. I have my degree in business administration from the Eller College of Management. I went to one of the best business schools in the United States. I know business, I know economics, I know finance, I know tax. Because Navajo Nation sent me out there, one of the young folks, and says, go get yourself educated, here's some scholarship money, and that's what I did. And they said to me, after you get your degree, you come back and you bring the knowledge back to the people, and that's what I'm doing. I'm telling you what I have found in the business schools. I also have my law degree from the University of Arizona College of Law, certificate in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy. I have my master's degree in International Economic Law and Policy. My doctoral dissertation revolves around my theory of revitalizing international trade among Indigenous people. I'm a lawyer. I'm also an associate justice with the Salt River Pima Maricopa Court of Appeals. I'm also the CEO and the co-founder of the ACES School, one of the members of the coalition that's hosting this event. I'm probably the only Navajo person who has the knowledge about international trade. Not even your lawyers in the DOJ has the knowledge of that. I do. And so again, I'm bringing the knowledge back to the people like I was told to do by my nullas. They told me, get educated, bring it back. I'm telling you what I found. I'm telling you about the solutions to the problems that I've identified. Before I go any further, this event, like I mentioned before, is hosted by the Navajo Entrepreneurship Coalition. The members of the coalition are the ACES School, my nonprofit organization, along with Adam Krappel, as well as Change Labs, also a nonprofit. Change Labs is here. I think Heather's walking around. She might be at the registration booth. A couple members. Who's in Change Labs? Over there? Change Labs? These are the folks from Change Labs. We also have the Diné Chamber of Commerce. Go ahead, raise your hand. Al Henderson, Anthony Martinez, Tony Hale. And then this lady, Lydell Davies. Sorry, Lydell. Our main mission with the Navajo Entrepreneur Coalition is to bring together like-minded people to pursue a common vision. And that vision is to grow the private sector in Navajo Nation. We're a unity of small businesses. We all run businesses, nonprofits, private businesses. I run my own law office, registered in Navajo Nation. I serve primarily Navajo clients. I represent Navajo businesses. So we're a coalition of small businesses. As small businesses, we know where the issues are in the Navajo economy. We all registered our business. Who in here has registered a business in Navajo Nation? So you know about the mess that goes with it, right? Who in here has to deal with the Navajo Tax Commission? That's always a fun experience, isn't it? There are issues with the registration process, the taxation scheme in Navajo Nation. Our coalition aims to identify the problems and propose solutions. And so we're bringing All Roads Lead to Chaco Canyon to the Navajo Nation. Again, this piece of art captures the visions of All Roads Lead to Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon, the ruins right there. In the background, we have the trade buildings. Like I mentioned before, if you look at the United States, there are ruins all across the United States of trade hubs, paths that lead to different cities, different towns among indigenous people. You look at right there on the West Coast, look at all those trade hubs, look at all the trade networks, all the way up into the Pacific Northwest, down into Mexico. This is just part of the map. There's also the trade networks on the East Coast, all the way up into Canada, the First Nations, Alaska, South America. There have been artifacts found in Chaco Canyon that come all the way from Florida, all the way from South America. There's Navajo turquoise that they found all the way on the East Coast in the ruins out there. Evidence that we knew how to do trade, we did international business. There are trade languages that tribes have. There was currency that tribes used. This is the state of Native nations today. You wonder, what happened to Native nations? What happened to our trade hubs? What happened to our way of business, our way of life? Yes, the federal government came along, put us on reservations. Yes, we have this thing called the trust doctrine, plenary power. But why? What is the source behind this? Why are things so bad on the reservations? Why can't tribes develop their economies? Why does it take so long to get a home site lease and a business site lease on Navajo Nation? Why do tribes have to get federal approval before developing any of the tribal lands? Why can't they sell their own lands? Why, right? Things are bad on Indian reservations. Again, we have the trust relationship with the federal government, right? Every single election that rolls around, tribes talk about it. President Biden, what about the trust relationship? Are you going to uphold the trust relationship? What is the trust relationship? There's this thing called plenary power. United States has plenary power over Native nations and Native people. What does that mean? Where did that come from? There was a failure by the United States to uphold treaties. Every single Indian treaty made with the United States has been broken. Why? There is no criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians on the reservation. We all know that sexual assault rates are 3 times higher on reservations. Native women experience sexual assault, rape, 3 times higher than any other ethnic group on a reservation. Why? What caused that? These things are symptoms of something greater. These things are signs of something sinister that lurks in the background. What is that? When you go into a hospital, doctors who deal with people who are sick, like IHS, you get people coming in there, they have asthma, emphysema, they have lung cancer, right? Doctors diagnose it. You have lung cancer, you have asthma, here's an inhaler. We got to put you on chemo. You also have some other symptoms, headache, all this, we're going to give you some Advil, all that. But what's causing all this, right? You think about it. Native people with all these health problems. What's behind the health behind Native people? If you dig deeper, you go onto the reservation, you find something like this, smokestacks going into the environment. The cause of lung cancer, the cause of asthma. What I'm doing is I'm drawing a parallel with federal Indian law. You see the symptoms out there. You're unable to register a business. Sexual assault is 3 times higher in reservations. We have no jurisdiction over non-Indian people. Things are bad on the reservation. The health of Indian country is decaying, but why? Where is the smokestacks? It's right here. It's this thing called federal Indian law. When I went to law school, I studied federal Indian law. And after studying federal Indian law and practicing law for almost 10 years, my recommendation to Native people, Native leaders, is to understand federal Indian law. All Native people should know federal Indian law. It doesn't matter if you're a manager, a supervisor, a janitor, a teacher, a lawyer, a doctor, you should understand federal Indian law. If you deal with tribes and Native people, you need to understand federal Indian law. And I'm going to tell you why. We all know what federal means. U.S. government, right? We know what the law means. What does Indian mean? What's an Indian? What's an Indian? Does anybody know what an Indian is? This? Yes, sir. What's an Indian? We need to get a microphone to pass around the mic. Shout it out. What's an Indian? Yes. Go ahead. What's an Indian, ma'am?
I would define it as someone who is an indigenous person that here is in the continental United States, or whatever land they're on.
Sounds good to me. Everybody hear that? Indigenous people in the continental U.S. Sounds fair to me. The federal government assigns Indian people numbers, right? Census numbers. You get your certificate, you're an Indian. You have your enrollment number, you're an Indian. You're a ward of the federal government. Just like when a prisoner gets taken into prison, they're given a number. That's a prisoner. We're given numbers. We're Indians. They keep track of us through the Bureau of Indian Affairs and through the Interior. That is the Indian according to the United States Supreme Court, according to Congress. Federal Indian law, to start out, is a body of law that governs the affairs of Native nations and Native people. It's comprised of congressional acts, it's comprised of legislation from Congress, and rulings from the United States Supreme Court. Let's start out with this, to understand federal Indian law. At one time, the United States, North America, belonged to indigenous people only, right? But we were taught in the American schools that in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? I was taught that. We were taught that Columbus discovered the New World, and he called that New World America. At the time of landing, he thought he was in India, and so he called the people there Indians, right? You all know this story. But the truth is that Columbus actually landed there in the Caribbean. People think he landed over there in Florida, over on the East Coast. He landed in the Caribbean. And the truth is that he made 4 voyages to the New World. And the truth is that Christopher Columbus enslaved, slaughtered, and raped indigenous people, him and his men. Columbus paved the way for European conquest of the Americas. If we look at the modern United States of America, we have this, right? This was way back when there was 13 original colonies. Some people call them the 13 original troublemakers. Something interesting happens when the 13 original colonies come about. You have the American colonists over here, you have the British over there. The colonies over here were under British rule. In 1760-something, we have the Stamp Act, right? No taxation without representation. American colonists get riled up. They fight with the British crown. You have the Boston Massacre, 1773. You have people dumping tea into the harbor. They're blaming the Indian people, right? And the Americans get into a fight with the British. Here's Paul Revere on his famous midnight ride, right? Battle of Lexington, Battle of Concord. The British are coming, and all that kind of nonsense. And the Americans start a revolution. They stand 10 across from the British people and they shoot each other, right? That's how Americans, white people, did warfare back then. Then the Americans win. They win the American Revolution. In 1776, they come up with a doctrine, the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, blah, 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 blah. 1787, the Americans come up with another document, the Constitution, right? We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, blah, 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 blah. The new American nation comes about with the Constitution. But wait a minute. What about the lands west of the 13 original colonies? What about those lands west of the proclamation line of 1763? They're inhabited by Indians, right? And so the question is, what do you do with those Indians? That was the question that the United States had to answer. The first president of the United States was George Washington. George Washington is an interesting guy because before the American nation came about, he used to fight with the Indians all the time. And George Washington had a method of dealing with indigenous people. So when he became president, he came up with the savage as the wolf policy. According to George Washington, what he says is, it's best if we don't fight with these Indians, because trying to drive them from their lands by force of arms is like driving the wild beasts of the forest. They will surely return as soon as the pursuit has an end. And so instead, he says, let's buy the lands from Native people. We just finished fighting with the British. We don't have the manpower, we don't have the resources, we don't have the money. But we can buy the lands of indigenous people. We can push them westward. We don't need to fight them. Let's make treaties with them. And according to George Washington, through this method, the savage as the wolf will die out. And as the American nation expands westward, the indigenous people will eventually become extinct. So according to Washington, we really shouldn't be sitting here in Twin Arrows. We shouldn't be here sitting here talking about economic development. He's probably rolling over in his grave, knowing that the Navajos are over here having casinos, having talks about economic development, learning about federal Indian law, right? Since the founding of the United States, here's a map of all the Indian lands that have been lost to the United States through war, genocide, breaking treaties, federal laws and policies, and most notably, the Dawes Act of 1887. Now we're left with this today, right? 574 recognized tribes in the United States. Navajo Nation seems to be doing pretty good. Here's the thing about federal Indian law. All this history that I just went over, there was something that was happening in the background between Congress and the United States Supreme Court, and that's called federal Indian law. It started with 3 cases with the United States Supreme Court called the Marshall Trilogy. The first one came about in 1823 called Johnson v. McIntosh. The second one was Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831. And a year later, we have Worcester v. Georgia. This is known as the Marshall Trilogy in federal Indian law. Let's start with the first one. Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, we had something interesting happen. We had 2 people, 2 Bilagana people, laying claim to the same parcel of land. One of them, Johnson, received title to that parcel of land from the Piankashaw Nation. McIntosh received title to that same parcel of land from the federal government. And so they brought a case before the United States courts to determine one question: who has superior title to this parcel of land? Is it the guy who got it from the Indians, or is it the guy who got it from the federal government? What do you guys think? Pretty easy, right? Federal government. McIntosh has superior title to that according to the United States Supreme Court. Why? Because of this thing called the doctrine of discovery. You all heard of that? The doctrine of discovery comes from the Catholic Church, the papal bulls. Under the doctrine of discovery, the European nation that discovers lands, even if those lands are inhabited by indigenous people, has title to those lands under the doctrine of discovery. According to the court, Native people, indigenous people only have what's called a right of occupancy. They don't have the title to land, but they have the right to occupy those lands. But the European nation holds superior title to those lands. The right of occupancy of indigenous people can be extinguished and terminated in two ways: purchase or conquest, according to the United States Supreme Court. The doctrine of discovery at the time was international common law. It was accepted worldwide. And so, what the court is saying, Native people were conquered. Conquest gives title to which the courts of the conqueror cannot deny. The law of nation prevails over indigenous people. Indigenous people who probably had no idea what the law of nations was. The court, if you read Johnson v. McIntosh, the court has some interesting language about Native people. What it says is, it says the doctrine of discovery and conquest, we think, finds some excuse, if not justification, in the character and habits of the people whose rights have been wrested for them. The Indian tribes inhabiting this country were fierce savages whose only known occupation of war. They were heathens. They were savages. They don't know the rule of law. They don't know how to manage their lands. But the European nations do. Under the doctrine of discovery, European nations have ultimate title to those parcels of lands. According to the court, this was indigenous people. This was the character and habits of Native people here in the United States. This is how they justified ultimate dominion over Native lands in the United States. This same doctrine of discovery has been applied to the First Nations in Canada. Even the indigenous people down in Australia and New Zealand, the United States has set a precedent of how to deal with indigenous people using false doctrines like the doctrine of discovery. We know today that the doctrine of discovery was wrong, and yet the Supreme Court has refused to overturn Johnson v. McIntosh. The conquering nation, according to Chief Justice John Marshall, made ample compensation to the inhabitants of New by bestowing on them civilization and Christianity in exchange for unlimited independence. They're saying, in exchange for taking their lands, we brought them civilization. We brought them Christianity. From the very start, the plan was to assimilate Native people, take everything from them, strip them of language, culture, strip them of their lands, everything that they knew, and let's give them the Bible. And if you look at Indian country today, we're forgetting our ceremonies, we're forgetting our prayers, our songs, and we're going to church. This was the plan from the start, the United States, to civilize and to bring Christianity to the indigenous people. In 1831, something else happens. The second case in the Marshall Trilogy. Cherokee Nation is marked there in the red. Georgia, the state of Georgia, comes up with a law. It says, Cherokee lands now belong to the state of Georgia. Back then, Cherokee Nation was a powerful nation. Cherokee Nation, all the nations on that side, what we know as the 5 civilized tribes, they were powerful nations. State of Georgia tries to usurp Cherokee lands. So Cherokee Nation brings an original action in the United States Supreme Court. Cherokee Nation says the state of Georgia cannot usurp, cannot take Cherokee lands. We want the United States Supreme Court to acknowledge this. But the United States Supreme Court has to deal with one issue first. Can Cherokee Nation sue the state of Georgia? If we look at the Constitution, Article 3, Section 2, it states that the United States Supreme Court has the authority to hear cases between a state or the citizens thereof and foreign states. So here's the question. Is Cherokee Nation a foreign state as it is defined and used under Article 3? Is Cherokee Nation like China? Is Cherokee Nation like Japan? Is it like Canada? Is it like the United States? Is it independent? What do you guys think? Are tribes independent? Are they independent nations? We talk about tribal sovereignty all the time, right? Native leaders say we're sovereign nations. Do we have the same kind of sovereign power as China, Korea, Japan? Mr. Brown's shaking his head. He's saying, no, we don't. What does the court say? Cherokee Nation tells the United States Supreme Court, we are a foreign nation. You even said so in Johnson v. McIntosh. You're calling us nations. Not only that, we made a treaty with the United States called the Treaty of Hopewell. Isn't it true under international law that only nations can make treaties with each other? You used international law in Johnson v. McIntosh, so isn't it true under international common law, which still exists to this day, that only nations can make treaties with one another? United States has a treaty with Japan. United States has a treaty with another country. Aren't we like that because we have treaties? It's a compelling argument. But the United States Supreme Court is not convinced. They say, no, you're not a foreign nation. Why? Well, according to the court, Chief Justice John Marshall, the United States exercises a title independent of your will. You look to our government for protection. You rely upon us for our kindness, appeal to us for relief to your wants. You even call the president your great father. What kind of nation does that? And the court says the framers of the Constitution didn't even have Native people in mind when they drafted that Constitution, right? The natives never even contemplated bringing suits into the United States. If anything, the appeal was to the tomahawk. It wasn't to the courts. It wasn't to the rule of law, because Native people are savage people. Their appeal was to the tomahawk. War. And so the court says, if anything, Native people, Native nations, you're more properly denominated as domestic dependent nations. You're in a state of pupillage. What does domestic dependent nations mean? Does anybody know that? What does it mean? I've been practicing law for 10 years. I cannot tell you what domestic dependent nation means. It exists only in American law. What is the extent of power of a domestic dependent nation? Did you guys know you're part of a domestic dependent nation? Most people don't, right? You're part of Navajo Nation, but did you know Navajo Nation is part of a domestic dependent nationhood? That's what we are according to the Supreme Court. This is the guardian-ward relationship, right? This is where the trust relationship comes from. So when you hear Native people talking about the trust relationship with the United States, this is what they're referring to. This is the origination of the trust relationship, the guardian-ward relationship. We are the wards of the United States. They are our guardians because we don't know any better. We're uncivilized. We're savages. This is why the federal government needs to make decisions for us. They need to sign off on our business site lease applications. They need to sign off on our home site lease applications. You want to build something out in your own lands, you have to get the permission of the secretary, right? This is where it comes from. The trust lands. Why you can't sell your lands? Because of Johnson v. McIntosh. You don't have title to your lands. The federal government does. That's where the trust land doctrine came from. This is not the end of it, people. This is only 1832. We still have another case. And then we have another one after that. A year later, something happens again in the same area. If you remember, Georgia has a law that says Cherokee lands are part of the state, and Georgia sovereignty, Georgia laws will now apply and extend into Cherokee Nation. There's a state law in Georgia at the time that prohibited anyone from going into Cherokee territory without a license and without taking an oath to uphold Georgia's laws and constitution. Of course, we have the Billigana missionaries whose sole job it is to go into Indian country and to civilize the native people, right? And that's what happens here. Missionaries go into Cherokee territory. They don't have a license. And 2 of them are sentenced to 4 years in the penitentiary under Georgia law. One of them, named Worcester, files a writ of error with the United States Supreme Court. He is saying, you can't do this because Georgia law should not extend into Cherokee territory. I was in Cherokee territory. How is it that I can violate a state law in foreign territory? If you're in Navajo Nation, can you break state law? Can Georgia usurp Cherokee lands and extend its laws over Cherokee Nation? The Supreme Court says no. State of Georgia, you cannot do this. Cherokee lands belong to Cherokee Nation. You cannot take them. You cannot extend your laws into Indian country. This is interesting, right? This sounds like a win for Native people. We'll take it. But what's the reasoning behind this? According to the court, it says, if you remember the history of federal Indian law, those 2 cases, Johnson v. McIntosh and Cherokee Nation, we said that the United States has an obligation to protect indigenous people, Native nations. We have the sole authority to deal with Native people and Native nations. This is a relationship that the state of Georgia cannot meddle in. Otherwise, you end up like these people, right? You meddle in stuff you shouldn't be meddling around with. State of Georgia, you cannot interfere with our relationship with Cherokee Nation. And today, with any of the 574 federally recognized tribes, no state can interfere with that relationship. Under the Marshall Trilogy, tribes are nations, but they're not full independent nations. They are domestic dependent nations. And to this day, we're still trying to figure out what the scope of authority and power that Native nations have in the United States. Tribes have sovereignty, but what's the extent of it? We can have governments, we have presidents, chairmen, councils, laws, and courts, right? But how much authority can we exert using these institutions? Federal Indian law is a curse. Each case that came out from the United States Supreme Court since the Marshall Trilogy has done more and more damage to the sovereignty of Native nations, Native lands, and Native sovereignty. It's a curse. It's like COVID. It's a sickness. Every case is a new variant that plagues Indian country, that makes us sick. The cases that have come out since the Marshall Trilogy have established the plenary power doctrine. They have said that Native nations have no criminal jurisdiction over non-Indian criminal defendants. This is why we saw white guys coming onto the reservation, raping and sexually assaulting Native women. Because of the United States Supreme Court. One of the worst things about federal Indian law, if you read through these cases, All of these cases I have up here, you can write them down, you can read these cases. I am not exaggerating the language. You'll read in there the text. Native people are savage, they're uncivilized. They're stupid people. They don't know how to manage their own lands. They don't know the rule of law. They don't have competent institutions. All of federal Indian law is based on these stereotypes. It's based on these notions of savagery. This is in the minds of the United States Supreme Court. The interesting thing is that I went on a trip to Washington, D.C. I went to the Museum of the American Indian, and I read about some of the history. I saw the artifacts that were used by Native nations, Native people throughout history in making treaties with the United States. In those artifacts, you saw the rule of law. In those artifacts, you saw governance. You saw leadership. You saw the way of peace through the pipes. But in the minds of the United States Supreme Court, U.S. Congress, that wasn't how Native people were. This is how we were. George Washington, 1783, when the gradual extension of our settlements will as certainly cause the savage of the wolf to retire, both being beasts of prey, though they differ in shape. In a word, there is nothing to be obtained by an Indian war but the soil they live on. And this can be had by purchase at less expense and without that bloodshed. U.S. v. Rogers in 1846, again, all of this is federal Indian law. From the very moment the general government came into existence to this time, it has exercised its power over this unfortunate race in the spirit of humanity and justice, and has endeavored by every means in its power to enlighten their minds and increase their comforts, and to save them, if possible, from the consequence of their own vices. Ex parte Crow Dog in 1883, another case decided by the United States Supreme Court, talking about tribal courts, talking about U.S. courts. It tries them not by their peers, nor by the customs of their people, nor the law of their land, but by superiors of a different race, according to the law of a social state of which they have an imperfect conception, and which is opposed to the traditions of their history, to the habits of their lives, to the strongest prejudices of their savage nature, one which measures the red man's revenge by the maxims of the white man's morality. U.S. v. Kagama in 1886, these Indian tribes are wards of the nation. They are communities dependent on the United States, dependent largely for their daily food, for their very weakness and helplessness, so largely due to the course of dealing with the federal government, with them in the treaties in which it has been promised. There arises the duty of protection, and with it the power. U.S. v. Sandoval, 1913, the people of the Pueblos, although sedentary rather than nomadic in their inclinations and disposed to peace and industry, are nevertheless Indians in race, customs, and domestic government. They are essentially a simple, uninformed, and inferior people. I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th, President Theodore Roosevelt. In 1980, Justice Rehnquist, William Rehnquist, wrote a lone dissent in a case called Sioux Nation, U.S. v. Sioux Nation. That case involved whether or not the Sioux Nation was entitled to just compensation for the federal government taking the Black Hills. The Black Hills were considered sacred to the Dakota people. The U.S. took them to mine for gold. Are the Dakota people entitled to just compensation? The court said yes, they are. But one justice disagreed with the majority, William Rehnquist. If you read through this, he lets you know exactly what he thinks about indigenous people, Native people. This was in 1980. 6 years after this, he will become the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. when the United States Supreme Court was under the direction and control of William Rehnquist, more damage had been done to Native nations and Native sovereignty than any other court that preceded William Rehnquist's court. Lone Wolf v. Hitchcock. In this case, the Kiowa chief, Lone Wolf, alleged that the U.S. defrauded the natives out of land and they violated the terms of the Medicine Law Treaty. The Supreme Court said that Congress has plenary power over Native people. Chief Lone Wolf was saying, we entered into a treaty with the United States where a certain amount of people's vote is required in order to take action. The United States did not abide by the terms of its treaty. We approached the United States the way that we approach any other nation, with an offering of peace, the peace pipe, the way of the Kiowa. And the United States has gone back on its word. And the United States Supreme Court says, so what? Under the principles of federal Indian law, you are the wards of the federal government. If we break a treaty with you, we do it in your best interest. We have this thing called plenary power over Native nations and Native people. You have no say in what happens in your everyday affairs. You have no say in where you're going to fish, where you're going to hunt. We determine that for you because that's the history of federal Indian law. Because that's how we've always dealt with indigenous people. That's how European nations have always dealt with indigenous people. This is common knowledge. In 1887, we saw one of the worst congressional acts when it came to indigenous peoples, the Dawes Act, pioneered by Henry Dawes. Under this act, Native lands were divided up, parceled out, and given to heads of households all across Indian country. The main purpose was to make Native people farmers, assimilate them. No more of this riding horseback on the plain and hunting the buffalo. This is your lands. This is the lands that you're going to farm. This is the lands that you're going to live on. Over 93 million acres of Native lands were lost to the United States because of the Dawes Act. Even the United States later, decades later, admitted this was one of the worst acts ever to come out of Congress. And so in 1934, they tried to rectify that through the IRA. The IRA was an attempt to fix what happened with the Dawes Act, to fix the state of Native nations, the decay. They tried to turn tribes into the United States, the same form of government. This is where you come up with the IRA constitutions, right? There's some tribes that have constitutions. Where did that come from? You think Native people just had constitutions that looked like the United States? It came from somewhere. This is where it came from. There was also an economic incentive behind the Dawes Act in 1934. And so the United States' main purpose was to give governance to Native people. Again, to supplant those traditional ways of governance, to supplant the laws that have stayed in place since time immemorial, and to make them look like the United States government and the state governments. In 1978, this is one of the biggest blows to tribal sovereignty in a case called Oliphant v. Suquamish Indian Tribe. This is when Chief Justice Rehnquist did some of the worst damage to tribal sovereignty. In this case, Rehnquist, who wrote the majority opinion, said Indian tribes do not have inherent authority criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians who commit crimes on reservations. And again, you'll see that there's a common theme in these cases. What these justices do is they reach all the way back to 1823, 1831. They say, if you look at the history of Indian law, the Marshall Trilogy, this court has always held that Native people are wards of the federal government. When you became a ward of the federal government, you were implicitly divested of criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians. This is why non-Indians can come onto the reservation, even the Navajo Nation. They can kill a Navajo Indian here in Twin Arrows Casino, and the Navajo courts have no jurisdiction over them. They cannot be tried or prosecuted in Navajo courts. And if you read this case, Oliphant, Rehnquist will tell you the reason for this is because tribes do not have competent institutions. They do not have competent courts. We cannot trust these savage people with the rights of American citizens. This is Oliphant, 1978. You can read this case for yourself, and I encourage every single person in this room to read not only this case, but the cases I'm talking about. 3 years later, another case comes about. Montana versus United States. This deals with civil jurisdiction over non-Indians. In this case, the Supreme Court held tribes cannot exercise civil regulatory jurisdiction over non-members on fee simple land within a reservation. There are only 3 exceptions to that. Those 3 exceptions are up here. What the Rehnquist court did since Chief Justice Rehnquist became Chief Justice of that court is they slowly stripped away jurisdiction that Native people had, whatever remained, slowly stripping any jurisdiction that they had over non-Indians. And what the court did is they relied on their decision in Oliphant to say, again, we don't trust them with criminal jurisdiction. Why should we trust these Native people with civil jurisdiction? Tribal laws should not apply to non-Indians unless these exceptions have been met. In studying federal Indian law, I'm not aware of any cases that have met these tests for the exceptions. The Supreme Court has never allowed tribes to exercise civil regulatory jurisdiction under one of these exceptions. Maybe an environmental case in the circuit courts, but you'd be hard-pressed to find the Supreme Court that will find the Native nations have civil regulatory jurisdiction over non-Indians. Here's an interesting one, the taxing power of tribes. In a case, McClanahan versus the Arizona Tax Commission. Every tribal leader should be aware of this case. Arizona versus the McClanahan. Those cases, the line of cases that came from the Supreme Court, reaffirm that tribes have the authority to tax. That was actually a question at some point. Do Native nations have the authority to tax? You would think they do, right? If you're a nation, you should have the authority to impose taxes. But that was actually a question that came before the Supreme Court, and they said, yes, they do. They do have the authority to do so. But here's the thing, though. Something came about after the taxation case, McClanahan. This thing called dual taxation. This is a very wacky, weird doctrine that even lawyers struggle to understand. For some reason, if you're doing business on the reservation, you might be liable for paying not only taxes to the tribe, but to the states as well. Some of these cases here, Cotton Petroleum, the court held that non-Indian companies that extract oil and natural gas from reservation lands may be subject to both tribal and state taxes. An Oklahoma Tax Commission, the court held that states could impose sales tax on non-Indians purchasing cigarettes from retailers on a reservation. Let me ask you guys a question. How the heck do you enforce something like that? Right? If you're a retailer on the reservation, if I have a store over in Kayenta, and we get a lot of Bilagana people from Germany coming through that town, and they want to buy some cigarettes, under this case, Oklahoma Tax Commission, I got to take those taxes and give them to the state of Arizona. I got to keep track of who's Navajo and who's Bilagana. How do you enforce something like that? Most people aren't even aware that something like this exists, right? Not until the state tax commission comes after you, then you got to explain yourself. How come you didn't comply with Oklahoma Tax Commission case? Because I don't know what the heck that means. Am I supposed to keep a ledger that shows how many white people came and purchased cigarettes from a retailer on the reservation? This is what makes doing business on a reservation so complicated. The United States Supreme Court. Do you think any of these justices ever lived on a reservation? Do you think they ever stepped foot on any reservation? So why the heck are they legislating from the bench? So again, we get back to our original question, right? Why are things so bad in Indian country? What's the cause of this? If you study federal Indian law, if you read the cases, look into some of the history of how the United States has dealt with Native nations and Native people, you'll get a good idea of why things are so bad on reservations. This is just a small number of cases that I'm telling you about. There are tons and tons of cases that have gone before federal courts, the circuit courts, 9th Circuit, 10th Circuit, 5th Circuit. Every time a case does, there is a high probability that they will rule against tribes. And it's a very dangerous precedent to set, right? This is what makes being Indian so difficult. Because of Oliphant, I have to worry about my female relatives being sexually assaulted by non-Indians. Because of Oliphant. Because of the Oklahoma Tax Commission, I got to figure out who the heck do I pay taxes to. Because of plenary power, I cannot go to the San Francisco Peaks and put down the offerings. Because the U.S. government has plenary power, we do not control our lives. This is how dangerous it is. United States tomorrow can pass a law that says Navajo Nation no longer exists. Apaches no longer exist. Hopis no longer exist. If you think I'm being dramatic, that actually happened in the 1940s and the 1950s. It was called termination era. The federal government took a list of federally recognized tribes and struck them off the list. You are no longer Indian people. The case that you hear about is Menominee Nation. To this day, they have not been able to get back on their feet because of termination era. Every single day that we lose our language, our culture, our songs, our prayers, our ceremonies, that we start to look more and more like Bilagana people. One of these days, somebody's going to say, why should they have their own nation? They're saying that about the 5 civilized tribes in Oklahoma. They don't speak Cherokee. They don't speak Choctaw. They don't speak Chickasaw. They don't look like Native people. They don't do ceremonies anymore. Why should they be a nation? the rate that we're going down the road of termination. So it's a lesson in nation building, culture, language, songs, prayers, ceremony. That will be our protection against termination. What we need to do is educate ourselves on things like this. When we talk about economic development, we need to keep this stuff in mind. We need to understand the problems, not just the symptoms, but the main problem. How do we uproot it? If we can't uproot it, how do we protect ourselves against something like this? How do we get around it? How do we navigate it? And like my grandmothers have always been saying, it's in the younger generation, the millennials, right? For us to get educated, to understand this stuff, to understand not only English but Navajo, and to come back here and say, hey, look, this is the curse of Indian country. So that's what I'm doing here. Again, all the years I spent away from Navajo Nation, spent years going to school with Bilagana people, grinding, studying, writing reports, taking bar exams, spending thousands of money, my money and Navajo money, to get educated, to tell you this is the curse that has been placed upon us. But there's a solution to it. And this conference talks about some of the solutions to the curse of federal Indian law. Thank you.